The morning Marcus died, I was on the roof of our retreat lodge, barefoot, laptop on my knees, patching a legacy API that Evan's cloud modernization plan had quietly broken. The alert had come through at 4:17 a.m. I didn't wait for permission. I rerouted, rebuilt, and stabilized the system before most people had poured their first cup of coffee. Evan, of course, showed up 5 hours later in his Tesla, sunglasses on indoors, flanked by his consultant friend Trent, and acting like the man who invented the internet instead of someone who forgot the Wi-Fi password last week. He didn't even acknowledge the alert, just stood there with his arms folded like he was waiting for a pizza delivery and I was 5 minutes late. "You know this isn't your personal vacation lodge, right?" he snapped, loud enough for the junior staff to hear. "Take your meeting somewhere else. This is my father's company now." A bird landed on the railing next to me. I looked at it. I looked at Evan. I closed my terminal session, slowly, stood up, said nothing. If you're still listening, and if you enjoy stories where legacy and logic beat ego and entitlement, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Seriously, it helps more than you think and keeps this whole thing going. Anyway, that moment on the roof, that's when I knew, not suspected. Knew it was never going to be the same. Evan had no clue what held this company together. Not the branding, not the dumb vertical reorg slides he kept presenting. It was the things nobody talked about, the cold chain fallback systems, the buried clause in our operational governance doc. The fact that I had been the one to sign off on the layered trust protocol with our 3 biggest clients. Trent, his consultant, looked like he'd copy-pasted his resume from a Reddit post. Last week, he'd tried to explain zero trust to me like I didn't handroll our first isolated access sandbox in a broom closet during the second quarter of 2008. My cables. My duct tape. They thought I was ornamental. Legacy. A polite leftover from a more analog era, but Marcus knew. He always knew. He never put me on stage. He never mentioned me in press releases. But he always looped me in when it mattered. When the 2013 breach swept through half the market, I was the one who found the pivot point. When the upstream vendor changed their encryption licensing at the last second in 2017, I was the one who rebuilt our system in 48 hours flat. Not flashy, not loud, but stable, consistent, quietly in control. Evan didn't want any of that. He wanted Trent's neon dashboards and swaggering LinkedIn posts. So I let him. I let them strip me from the email chains, let them move our infrastructure meetings to smaller, faster teams, let them shift my workstation from my preferred lodge deck to a 4th-floor cubicle next to the cold vending machine that always ate your dollar. And still, I kept the logs clean. I cleaned up Trent's sloppy subnet reroutes. I patched their half-baked compliance tool before our EU auditors noticed. I put a buffer around the Jenkins deployment Evan insisted on streamlining. I kept my mouth shut for a while, because Marcus always told me, don't waste energy on temporary noise, just make sure the core stays intact. And the core, the real core, was built to recognize only one authority if anything ever went truly off the rails. Me. It didn't even take 7 days after Marcus was buried before Evan came in swinging like he'd just bought the place with his own 2 hands. He gave some contrived speech to the leadership team about ushering in a new era, like we were a Roman Empire instead of a mid-sized systems firm running 3 major clients and a boatload of delicate infrastructure, held together by 20 years of careful layering and duct tape level knowledge. He'd barely taken the office when the memos started flying in. Mandatory in-office rotations, no exceptions. Collaboration thrives in shared spaces, Evan wrote, as if that hadn't been debunked by every post-pandemic productivity study in existence. He banned remote work, canceled our rotating lodge work schedule, set core hours, and started doing these surprise Slack video calls like we were naughty teenagers he needed to catch skipping curfew. The cherry on top? All system architecture decisions were to be routed through Trent now. Trent, whose last job, according to a quiet LinkedIn search I did during a compliance check, was digital futures consultant at a startup that hadn't tweeted in 18 months and whose website still had lorem ipsum on the pricing page. I had a weekly routine, always had. Every first week of the quarter, I worked remote from the lodge, not for fun, for systems maintenance. It's when I'd run full-stack audits, refresh token vaults, and update the lower-tier integrations. It was a part of our rhythm. Hell, it was even noted in our internal ops calendar as Q-mate rotation C. Avery. So I sent the email, same as always. Per rotation schedule, I'll be working remote next week. Core systems audit and patching in progress. I figured maybe he'd bark a little, maybe puff his chest, but I'd done this over 40 times, and even the founder himself used to check in by video while I did it. Instead, Evan replied, in bold, all caps, like he thought the louder the font, the more power it gave him. This isn't a vacation lodge. It's my father's company now. He didn't even sign it, just left it there, cold, petty. I didn't respond, didn't argue, didn't explain how that lodge had been wired with custom hardware acceleration and failover support that I installed. Didn't remind him that my rotation was the reason the customer uptime SLAs had been rock solid through 2 presidential administrations and 3 CFOs. Instead, I clicked into a folder I hadn't touched in years. Buried inside my encrypted drive, marked with a string of numbers only Marcus and I understood. Raincrest governance, system triggers, and clause 14B. It was a little insurance policy, something Marcus had pushed for quietly after a near-acquisition scare years ago. We'd built a continuity clause into the infrastructure governance stack, an embedded logic that, in the event of leadership change or founder death, would shift administrative decisioning authority over digital infrastructure to not the board, not the successor, but the original architect. There was a notarized agreement, cross-referenced in our digital asset policy. There was a framework hash, registered with our external legal counsel. There were logs of every system iteration and deployment under my name, the operational backbone of Raincrest. I wasn't just legacy, I was the legacy. I scrolled through the documents that night in silence, the cursor hovering over the activation script that had never needed to be touched, the one Marcus called the parachute switch. His words, not mine. And as I stared at that script, I realized something chilling in its clarity. Evan didn't just underestimate me. He had no idea he wasn't in charge of the thing he thought he owned. It started over black coffee and too little sleep in a data center that didn't have proper chairs back then. Just folding ones and extension cords snaking like vines around our ankles. Marcus had been pacing in his socked feet, muttering about succession plans and how trust isn't a KPI. I was debugging an authentication cascade when he stopped mid-step and said, "We need a dead man switch, something real, something legal." I looked up. For what? For when I'm not around to say no. That was Marcus. The man had vision, and buried in all that charisma was a kernel of real fear. He didn't trust the future, not blindly. He knew money made people sloppy, that someday someone would come in with a last name but no clue. Someone like Evan. So we built the failsafe. Quietly. System by system. We called it the framework chain. Sounded innocuous enough. But under the hood, it was a layered authority protocol wrapped in biometric gates, cryptographic sign-offs, and escalation barriers that would only unlock under one condition: a verified founder death and a subsequent system-level authority shift attempt. The trigger clause, 14B, was coded into the root of our infrastructure governance. You couldn't see it unless you were part of the original Keegan group. That group was exactly 2 people, Marcus Raincrest and me. Clause 14B didn't just flag transitions, it rewrote the access table. In plain English, if Marcus died and someone tried to override system-level privileges without my sign-off, the architecture would default into emergency brake mode, locking out all non-authorized users and rerouting core privileges to the original architect of record. That wasn't Evan, it was me. The clause had a dual verification mechanism, biometric token match, my retina, not his, and key file access generated from a local physical node at the lodge server, one no one but me had touched in nearly 8 years. It was notarized, registered, baked into the founding documents under a dull title, Operational Integrity Continuity Protocol. No one questioned it at the time because Marcus was alive and I was the quiet lady in the flannel shirt who made sure the emails went through and the firewalls didn't collapse. But Marcus didn't just trust me with his systems. He trusted me to outlive his son's ignorance. The kicker? The clause was embedded in such a way that using it wouldn't even look dramatic. No big red button, no alarms, just a quiet reversion, access tokens timing out, permissions revoking. Evan thinking the Wi-Fi was slow while the system reorganized behind his back. I ran a dry simulation that night, just a silent little test. A heartbeat ping to the node, a match on the protocol hash. It replied in less than a second. Architect token validated. Authority override standing by. I didn't trigger it. Not yet. But I slept soundly for the first time since the funeral, because Evan didn't know it yet. But if he kept pushing, if he kept treating the system like a game of Monopoly, he was going to find out what happened when you pulled the emergency brake at full speed. Trent's first official act as Raincrest's de facto head of systems was to hold a meeting called The Reimagining. No agenda. Just him pacing around the conference room with a half-drunk yerba mate and a whiteboard marker like he was launching a SpaceX rocket and not poking around a decades-old infrastructure stack with live client data. He said words like synergy and cloud-native compliance layer and agile swarm security fabric. None of it meant anything. But Evan clapped like a seal in mating season and handed him full back-end credentials by the end of the hour. Within days, things started shifting. Firewalls were reconfigured. He dropped alert thresholds without logging the changes. Our custom-built escalation tree, carefully tuned over years to flag unusual port activity, was bypassed in favor of whatever default the new SaaS security vendor shipped with their glossy UI. The vendor was called WatchRoot. It sounded like something a startup bro dreamed up during a juice cleanse. It also didn't integrate with our legacy identity layer or our key rotation protocol, which I told them. Twice. With documentation, didn't matter. They pushed it live on a Thursday at 4 p.m. By Friday morning, I noticed the first anomalies. Patch schedules weren't syncing. Logs were missing entries. One of our dev staging nodes had gone dark for 7 hours and nobody even noticed. Trent, when I asked, said, "That's probably just the old system phasing itself out." I flagged it, formally, sent a risk memo to InfoSec and CC'd legal. Evan replied within the hour, not to me directly, but to legal, with a single sentence. He's optional. System ops can go through Trent now. He. Not even my name, just erased mid-thread. 20 years of knowledge treated like the lint under his Peloton. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat at the lodge with my terminal open, logs scrolling like ticker tape. My dog snored at my feet. The mountain air was still. At 3:42 a.m., the first alert hit. Privilege drift detected. Clause 14B triggers engaged. 2 seconds later, founder's status, deceased. Last will flag confirmed. Governance authority transfer pending. I stared at the screen. The system had been monitoring behind the scenes, like it was designed to, and now it had seen enough. Someone had attempted to modify core architecture access without proper sign-off, and the founder's death certificate had been validated in the ledger 3 weeks ago as part of estate processing, which meant the protocols were live. The emergency brake wasn't theoretical anymore. The chain of trust had activated. My name was now being pulled up by the core kernel for role elevation, just as we wrote it. Just as Marcus wanted. No fanfare, no drama, just the system quietly deciding it was done being mismanaged. I sat back, heart thudding. Evan thought I was gone. Trent thought he was the future. But the system disagreed, and the system never blinked. They say silence is power, but they never tell you how loud it gets right before it drops. It was a Monday. Rain slicing sideways across the plate glass windows of the boardroom. Evan had made a show of arriving late, wearing that smug leather jacket like he was auditioning for a Netflix series about hedge fund princes. Trent trailed behind him like a nervous intern who'd misplaced his laptop charger. Marcus Raincrest's will was in a thick manila folder on the table, untouched. The firm he'd used, old money estate attorneys with last names like Prescott and Hallowell, had flown in a partner for the reading. No Zoom, no digital copy, just paper. That's how Marcus was. He trusted machines more than people, but legal things? He wanted them on something you could burn. The lawyer, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a voice that could freeze bourbon, read through the standard items first. Property allocations, stock distributions, a donation to his alma mater's engineering department, a fund for the lodge's long-term maintenance. Evan looked bored, probably thought he already had the kingdom sewn up. Then the page flipped and the lawyer's tone changed. "There is a clause," she said, "regarding governance authority as it pertains to system architecture and digital security." I stopped breathing. She read slowly, deliberately. "In matters of system architecture and digital security, final authority shall rest with the individual who originally designed, implemented, and maintained the operational core of Raincrest Systems' digital infrastructure." A pause. "The designated individual," she continued, "is named explicitly in Addendum B as Mr. Colin Avery." Silence. Then a sound. Pen tapping. Evan leaned forward, annoyed. "Who's Colin?" He looked at the lawyer, then at the board, then at Trent. Half the room turned toward me. I didn't move. I didn't blink. I didn't smile. I just sat there, hair pulled back, neutral blouse, flat expression, watching them connect dots they never bothered to see before. A VP in marketing whispered, "Colin, wait, her middle name?" Another said, "That's the old user ID on the core Git archive, Cavalry." Trent paled. Evan scoffed. "You're telling me she has authority over... what, the IT guys?" The lawyer flipped to another page. "No, over everything built under the operational systems framework. That includes client access, deployment, compliance tooling, and authentication layers." Evan's pen slipped off the edge of his notepad. I hadn't spoken yet. Not a word. I didn't need to. The paper had spoken. The system had spoken. Marcus had spoken. Through documentation more powerful than any eulogy Evan gave at the funeral he barely stayed sober for. The lawyer placed the folder in front of me. "Ms. Avery, as outlined, governance authority is now yours, per the founder's will and corroborating documentation embedded in Clause 14B of the System Governance Bylaws." Trent whispered something to Evan. Evan just stared. And I finally spoke. "I'll need a clean export of all change logs from the last 90 days. Trent's access is now read only, and you'll want to pull the alert logs from the SaaS suite." "Why?" Evan snapped. I stood. "Because the thing you thought you were running just tapped me on the shoulder," I said, "and asked me to clean up your mess." They scheduled the emergency meeting for 7 a.m., probably hoping I wouldn't show. Or maybe hoping I'd panic, come in rattled, and give them a reason to claim I was unstable or unfit, or whatever other lazy label people slap on women who don't flinch when the room turns hostile. I arrived at 6:55, calm, coffee in hand, folder tucked under my arm. When I stepped up to the elevator, the first sign things had already shifted stared me straight in the face. "Access denied, Evan Raincrest." That message wasn't for me. It was still faintly glowing on the screen when I tapped my card and placed my palm against the scanner. The reader turned green, chirped softly, and the elevator doors opened like a bowing butler. The system had flipped. The governance kernel had taken hold. That meant every access protocol, every admin flag, every operational override now ran through a single validation gate. Mine. By the time I stepped into the boardroom, the air was sour with confusion and fragile male panic. Evan was already seated, red in the face, arguing in low tones with legal and trying to convince one of the infrastructure guys to just roll back whatever the hell she did. What I did was nothing. The system did what it was built to do. I laid the folder on the table, opened it, pulled out 3 things: a copy of Clause 14B, the notarized diagram of the authority framework, and a printout of the digital infrastructure amendment Marcus and I had submitted to legal 10 years ago. Signed, witnessed, sealed. "This isn't a debate," I said, voice steady. "It's a confirmation." I handed the documents to the lead counsel. Per the bylaws and per the triggering event, founder death, unauthorized privilege drift, and attempted structural override, Clause 14B activates. The system is now in rollback, and no changes can be made without my explicit authorization. Evan stood up so fast his chair screeched against the floor. "This is insane," he barked. "There's gotta be a workaround. We can't just hand over the company to the person who designed it," I said, not even raising my voice. "To the person your father trusted to protect it." Legal cleared her throat, expression unreadable. "She's correct. I've reviewed the clause, the witness logs, and the embedded system triggers. Without her sign-off, the platform will enter fallback protocol within 72 hours. That includes vendor desync, access token invalidation, and full reversion to the last clean compliance build. Trent shifted uncomfortably. That means, I said, cutting him off gently. Your changes won't just be ignored. They'll be erased. The system doesn't recognize your authority anymore, not even as a ghost. Evan's voice cracked. We own this company. We can override it. No, I replied. You inherited a company, but you signed off on an architecture you didn't read. You put your name on every update Trent made without auditing a single dependency chain. And the system, your system, decided that was a threat. Silence. Thick and total. I didn't gloat, didn't smile, I just started outlining the remediation plan. One by one, the board members leaned in, pens clicking, listening. Because the moment you show them the fire map and the way out, they stop asking how it started, and start asking if you'll lead. By midweek, Evan had completely lost the script. He stormed out of the strategy session before the slides even loaded, slammed a door so hard the fire panel triggered, then spent 10 minutes pacing the hallway yelling into his phone. Probably to a lawyer, possibly to his mother. No one cared. The office had shifted. Gravity had tilted, and he was no longer at the center of it. I was in the war room, quietly walking legal and ops through the forensic logs. Time-stamped access failures, credential mismatches, unauthorized schema changes, all traceable to Trent's laptop and Evan's approving signature. It wasn't sabotage, it was negligence with a punchline. Trent showed up 20 minutes late to the same meeting, looking like a man who'd just realized the party was over and he'd danced through it with his fly down. Evan had dragged him in to provide a rebuttal, a defense, maybe a distraction. Instead, when asked to walk us through the back-end deployment pipeline, Trent mumbled, I can't even access the console anymore, and adjusted his collar like he was hoping it might teleport him out of the room. That was the last time anyone asked him a question. Evan, red-faced and furious, tried a different angle. This is a power grab, he shouted. You've been waiting for this, lurking in the shadows with your little trapdoor claws. You think you're better than everyone because you've been here since dial-up. Not better, I said calmly. Just prepared. He turned to the board. She's undermining my authority. But the board wasn't looking at me like a mutineer. They were looking at me like someone who still knew where the light switches were in a burning building. Legal already had everything. Hard copies, digital backups, notarized versions. The clause was real. The system logs were clean. The alerts were traceable. And his signature, on every bad decision Trent pushed, was on file. You could feel it then. The subtle click when a room collectively decides to pivot away from someone. Like watching a herd change direction mid-gallop, leaving one unlucky fool facing the wrong way. I passed out a 2-page summary. No drama, just facts. Immediate rollback of unauthorized changes. Reinstatement of original operational roles. Third-party review of Trent's compliance impact. Recommendation for Evan's temporary removal pending operational audit. The vote wasn't dramatic, no shouting, no all in favor formality, just nods, pens, silence, unanimous. Afterward, I walked out, documents still in hand, past the security desk where Evan stood, pacing like a man waiting for a lifeboat that wasn't coming. He looked up as I passed, eyes rimmed red, jaw twitching like he wanted to say something but couldn't decide between an apology or a threat. I didn't give him either. I didn't break stride. He got his company. He just didn't know how to run it. And now it was quietly, legally, structurally slipping through his hands, like water he thought he owned because someone else poured it for him. They didn't make a big announcement. No press release, no all-hands call with fake smiles and spin. Just a quiet update to the org chart, a private email from the board, and a calendar invite titled Transition Scope Final. Inside that meeting, they handed me the reins. Director of Infrastructure and Continuity Governance. Bit of a mouthful, but it meant exactly what Marcus had intended it to mean. No more being sidelined, no more explaining root access to people who thought PowerPoint was a system tool. No more watching clueless inheritors break things they couldn't name. The board reinstated our original protocols within 48 hours. Evan, still spinning from the vote, had offered some half-hearted resistance, asked to transition into an advisory role, whatever that meant. They called it what it was, an indefinite sabbatical. There was no announcement. He just stopped showing up. His name quietly disappeared from the leadership directory. His keycard access revoked, not by me, but by the system he never learned how to control. The transition report was clinical, almost brutal in its precision. It outlined a full breakdown: unauthorized architecture overrides, breach of continuity governance, failure to consult designated authority, elevated security risks due to third-party interference. Trent wasn't mentioned by name. He didn't need to be. By that point, he'd ghosted his final meeting and sent back his badge via overnight courier, no note included. The new CTO, Dana, came from a competing firm we'd always respected. First meeting with her, she pulled out a notepad, an actual one, and said, "I've read your logs, but I'd rather hear it from you." She didn't posture. She didn't claim to know what she didn't. And when I explained how the continuity kernel was designed, she nodded like someone who understood that power isn't in control, it's in responsibility. I didn't move offices. I didn't ask for more staff. I didn't touch the corporate parking spot that had been sitting empty with Evan's name still stenciled on it. Instead, I kept my chair out on the deck of the lodge, the same one Evan once mocked me for using. I tuned the alert thresholds back to their original baselines, cleaned the redundant cron jobs, rolled back the faulty SaaS layers, and re-enabled our internal compliance mesh, which hadn't glitched once in over a decade. Clients didn't notice anything, because nothing went down. That's the difference between loud leadership and quiet ownership. My mornings were peaceful again. I'd sip my coffee while watching the logs scroll, catching errors before they bloomed. Sometimes I'd smile at the names of systems no one but Marcus and I ever understood. Hearthstone, Backline, Bastion Root, our little private jokes. The infrastructure didn't just run, it listened. And now, finally, so did the people in charge. A month later, everything looked the same on the surface. The logo, the leadership bios, the stock photo of smiling engineers pretending to code. But under the hood, everything had changed. The chaos had been scrubbed, the systems reset. It was like cleaning up after a storm no one wanted to admit happened. And then the new Rain Crest Systems website launched. Clean, polished, predictable. But if you scrolled all the way down, past the press quotes, the founder's memorial tribute, even the careers page footer, there was a line, faint gray on gray, almost like it didn't want to be noticed. Core Systems Architecture, Clause 14b, Governance Authority, C. Avery. It wasn't a flex. It wasn't a threat. Just a line of legal truth. A signature written in code and redundancy, embedded in the very bones of the infrastructure they'd once tried to yank away from me like it was something they could reinvent with a rebrand and a consultant with good hair. I didn't tell anyone it was there. Didn't need to. One evening, while I was in the lounge reviewing token access logs, a junior developer wandered over. She'd only been with us a few months. Smart, sharp, still in that curious stage before corporate polish wears people down. She held up her tablet, that faint line highlighted. "Is that real?" she asked. "You really built the whole thing?" I took a slow sip of coffee and looked her in the eye. "Not the whole thing," I said, setting the cup down. "Just the part they didn't respect, until it locked them out." She grinned, like she'd just found a secret passage in an old novel. I didn't say more. I didn't have to. Because systems remember what people forget. And buried in the architecture, in every line of logic and escalation protocol, was the one thing Evan and his ilk never understood. Power doesn't shout. It waits. It listens. And when it's built right, it protects itself from the people who think they deserve it simply because they showed up late with a surname and a spreadsheet. In the end, it wasn't revenge. I didn't need to break anything, burn anything, scream anything. I just wrote a clause, buried it where only the system would care. And when the time came, it read it and closed the door behind them.